either conservative agenda or some, highly environmental agenda. I'm just interested to know how it works, how things are going. I'd like you to talk about your agenda. And
Now tell me about the cough button.
well, if you cough, you want to press it. But the thing is that all our mics are on, so we would hear it. You need to put your earphones on, both of you, and then Dr. Dombeck, could you get closer to the microphone or pull it closer to you? Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And Mike is
we'll
good enough.
Okay.
For me.
And Brad, certainly from.
Hope you had a good weekend. Maybe you took a hike in the local mountains or even visited a national forest not too far from Southern California. We don't live in the forest, so it's hard to imagine its sublime and rich environment sitting right here in Pasadena. It's also difficult to imagine that the National Forest is part of the federal government, and though it belongs to us, the people, it has to be managed with an eye on many different competing interests. The United States Forest Service is the arm of the federal government that manages the country's 191 million acres of national forest. My guest this morning has been chief of the U.S. Forest Service for the last 3 years. Michael Dombeck. Dr. Dombeck comes to the job with degrees in biology, zoology, and fisheries biology, and experience as acting director of the Bureau of Land Management. Mike Dombeck, welcome to Talk of the City.
Well, good morning, Linda. It's just great to be here. It's great to be away from Washington, where I left about 4 inches of snow on the ground.
Well, you're about as far away as you could get, so we welcome you here. Now, you grew up in the forests of Wisconsin, and you might have been a logger. You might have become a logger yourself, but instead you chose science and public policy. Why did you move in that direction?
Well, I've always enjoyed the outdoors, and having grown up 25 miles from a town of 1,500, the matter of fact, I have lots of friends, and my college roommate is in the logging business as we speak, and we really had a choice of doing about two things growing up in a rural area like that. You could work in the woods, and I actually did that for a couple of summers where we cut aspen, and the other thing we could do was work at the fish camps, the lodges and resorts where people from Minneapolis and St. Paul, from Chicago, came on vacation. And one of the things was sort of magical about being out on those big, beautiful lakes. The woods have lots of bugs in them, and wood ticks and mosquitoes in the spring and summer, and you get out on these big, beautiful lakes with the breeze blowing, and it's very comfortable out there. And fishing is fun, but there's another thing about the years I spent as a fishing guide, is you really get to know people well. People from all walks of life enjoying themselves in the outdoors in a very relaxed atmosphere, and even 20 and 30 years later, I still hear from people that I used to fish with and got to know their families and their kids very well. It's just a wonderful way to grow up.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were growing up, did you have a sense that the forest was a sort of a hotbed of issues? Was this something when did that actually come to you? That the forest was a place where there were these competing interests?
Probably not at that time, although there were controversies, and of course the fires. In fact, I grew up within sight of one of the old lookout towers that still is there. It's called the West Fork Tower, and it was about a half mile from our house. We could see it from the backyard, and I used to go up there as a youngster, but I also got to see a lot of the good things the Forest Service did. Also, at that age, I would, as a kid, go up the fire tower with George Dykeman, who was a forestry technician and manned the lookout tower at that time, and we would talk about fires, and I would see the reforestation work that was going on, the tree planting, the beginning of the development of more campgrounds, and of course some of the timber operations. And a lot of people in that part of the country made a living logging, and as a matter of fact still do.
Mm-hmm. But it doesn't sound like there was really any contentious sort of business going on at that time. When did things start to really heat up in terms of Forest Service policy?
Well, I think the natural resource policies have always been controversial in the United States, and I think it's my exposure to that probably really when I began working at the regional level. I worked in the Midwest. My first duty station with the Forest Service was on the Hiawatha National Forest, which is in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. In fact, my first office overlooked Lake Superior, and was probably the nicest office I ever had.
What are you doing here?
And I then, after several years, worked in the California region when the regional office was on 630 Sansom Street. And I think it was really here in California that I began to see and be exposed to more of the controversies. But if we take a look at the history of natural resource management, it always has been controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't view that controversy as something that's bad. As a matter of fact, I view it as something that's good, because we in the United States have choices.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we have this 191 million acres, the 155 national forests around the country as our heritage is something that very few developed countries have. Your birthright by being a citizen and being born in the United States is being the automatic owner of a few acres of public land. And now the debate and the controversy is because we have choices. The other option is called a dictatorship. And in fact, we spend a tremendous amount of energy within the Forest Service having public meetings, getting public input, making sure the public is involved and understanding and has a say in the management of their public lands, and that's very, very important to us.
This is Talk of the City on FM 89.3 KPCC. We're talking about the National Forests this morning with U.S. Forest Service Chief Michael Dombeck. And we're taking your calls at 626-793-3667. If you have questions about the Forest Service, about environmental policy involving the forest, or if you'd like to discuss issues surrounding forest economy, the number here at Talk of the City is 626-793-3667. Mike Dombeck, when you took over as head of the Forest Service, were you somewhat apprehensive? One reporter wrote that when you inherited the service, it was about the biggest mess government had to offer.
The Forest Service has a lot of challenges, but I also want to recognize the fact that we're living in a changing society with changing values, and in a democracy, government is also designed to be slow. So we don't make snap decisions. We don't do the wrong things in knee-jerk type reactions. And we are adapting to the changes that are occurring in society. For example, if you ask yourself, what do the citizens of the United States, the owners of the national forest, what is it that they value the forest for today, say compared to 50 years ago, compared to 100 years ago? Those values continue to change, and we need to adapt to those values. At the turn of the century, when the forests were established, the concern was really the clear cutting and the destruction that had occurred on the forests, particularly in the Appalachians, in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest where I grew up, where we had, in fact, the most serious fire ever to occur in the United States was the Peshtigo fire in northern Wisconsin, and it was 1871, and it occurred the very same day that the Chicago fire occurred. And our topsoils were eroding, the trees were gone, and we had 80 million acres of barren stumplands, and the beginning of bringing science-based forestry to the United States that our first chief, Gifford Pinchot, brought, along with his good friend, President Theodore Roosevelt, that really were responsible for this conservation era. And we moved into the 1930s with the CCC era, the Civil Conservation Corps, that were responsible for reforesting many millions of acres of lands in the United States, and those that were involved in that wonderful program are still talking about it today.
Robert in Glendale. Go ahead, Robert. You're on Talk of the City. Hello, Robert. Good morning. Well, we need to maybe get a little background on forest economy, and maybe Dr. Dombeck can kind of fill us in. Why do we need to be charged to see our own forests?
Robert, I'm pleased that you enjoy the National Forest and get out and get some exercise. In fact, one of the things that, as I was talking with Linda earlier, that people more and more value the National Forest for is the open space, the opportunity to recreate. In fact, we provide more outdoor recreation than anyone else in the United States. With regard to the fee, we've got money problems, and we need to face that. In fact, investment in natural resources in the United States is very different today than it was, say, 30 years ago. The appropriated dollars for all of natural resources in the United States, that includes the Forest Service budget, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and many others, is 50% of what it was in 1962 in proportion to the federal budget. And we've got this tremendous growth in recreation. In fact, 30 million visits on the Angeles National Forest, and with that comes the need for services and the greater demand. And so we've got a program that I hope that you will support appropriations for, Robert, because I think one of the most important things we can do is make investments in land. Now, one of the things with regard to the Adventure Pass program, as we move to look for ways to pay for these, is that money is invested right back into the specific areas where it's collected from. It's not money that goes and ends up in the Treasury in Washington and is allocated to other programs. So at least I hope that part of it makes you feel a little bit better.
Robert, are you still there?
Well, I guess I'd have to refer to one of our experts with regard to jail. I guess I wouldn't worry about that too much. But the fact is, we need to look for ways to support these programs. We have, for example, an $11 billion backlog across the country in maintenance of our infrastructure. That includes roads, trails, campgrounds, and this type of thing. And it's interesting. It's easy to get money to build new things, but then how do you maintain them year after year after year in what's not a very glamorous appropriation? So I would just make your wishes known to members of Congress and others, and I appreciate the feedback from you, Robert.
Robert, thanks so much for your call. This is Talk of the City on FM 89.3 KPCC. I'm Linda Othen and Gerard. My guest this morning is Dr. Mike Dombeck. He's the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and we're taking your calls at 626-793-3667.
I thought you did perfect, but there is no fines yet.
Michael Dombeck this morning, and if you have questions for Michael Dombeck, the number here at Talk of the City is 626-793-3667. Mike, before I started reading about this, I really had no idea of how privatized the forest economy was. I mean, I understood that there were problems with loggers, and there were problems with spotted owls, there was problems with environmentalists, there were problems serving the people who use the forest for recreation, but I really didn't understand about how the private public economy, forest economy, really worked. Can you kind of fill us in on that?
Linda, I think what we see is the fact that people have been tied to the land for all of history, in fact, human history, and we remain very dependent upon the land, although maybe in different ways. And the Forest Service has a multiple use mandate, and the challenge that we have there then is to balance the uses. And just to give you an idea.
When did that start, though? I mean, when did public land actually become exploited by private parties?
Well, the fact is, as we look at the history of the settlement of the United States, we've gone through several eras. And if you would date back, say, to the Revolutionary War, and immediately after the Revolutionary War, what you had is the land was considered the wealth of the nation. We didn't have an income tax. We generated wealth in the United States in two ways: by charging tariffs and by selling off the public domain. In fact, we had 1.8 billion acres of public domain lands in the United States. And today, what remains of that was not homesteaded, given to railroads, or sold, are your national parks, your national forests, and the 270 million acres that the Bureau of Land Management is responsible for managing.
In terms of logging work right now?
What we do is we harvest today about 3.4 billion board feet off the national forest nationally.
Mm-hmm.
That's enough wood for about 225,000 single-family homes.
Mm-hmm.
We have lots of other activities on the national forest. For example, we've got a 383,000 mile road system. We graze 9.3 million animal unit months, head months of grazing on the national forest. We have mining operations. We have 133,000 miles of hiking trails. We have 23,000 recreation sites. We've got 4,300 developed campsites that people can camp on. We've got 7,700 miles of scenic byways. The values of national forests in these lands are many, and our challenge under the multiple use mandate is a balance to make sure that we're operating in a sustainable way so future generations have the benefits of the water. And by the way, I want to highlight water because I'm talking a lot about water.
Because you grew up on the water.
I grew up on the water, and I hope we brought rain to the San Gabriel.
You obviously did.
to
It's raining
California.
right now. No, I don't know.
But the fact is that the cleanest water in the United States is coming off of our forested lands and our national forests. In fact, 35% of the water that flows into the LA Basin flows off the Angeles National Forest. 20 million acres of national forests in California. There's 18 of them. We get about 50% of the runoff in the state. So if we look at the value of commodities and we think about timber and we think about grazing and we think about recreation and hunting and fishing and hiking and biking and all of these things, perhaps water is one of the most significant things. Now, let me make one other point while we're talking about the economy. The values that the public derives from national forests are really tremendous. The national forest lands contribute about $120 billion each year to the gross domestic product.
But when you came on board, you were one who found that, in fact, the federal government should be making much more money from the forest, and that billions, maybe billions, had been lost because of mismanagement. How did you find that out, and how did you clean that up?
I would say the losses were not due to mismanagement or necessarily losses. What we had is as we take a look at timber sales and the concept of below-cost timber sale, which in my view we shouldn't even be talking about. We should be talking about what the land needs. What's the desired future condition that we want on the landscape, and then how do we get there?
Mm-hmm.
Because once the large trees are gone, we still have to make investments in land, but the values aren't there. So what we have is we have marginal values perhaps of timber or other things that can be taken from the land, and just like a private landowner, we need to be making investments in land. But the fact is, the way a timber sale operates is operators bid on the sale, and the premise that we continue to work for is fair market value in the sale of commodities, mining operations, those kinds of things. And there are some inequities in the laws. For example, the 1872 mining law is one that many secretaries of Interior have tried to revise to get fair market value for hard rock minerals, and that requires an act of Congress, and I'm sure future administrations will be working to that end as well.
This is Talk of the City on FM 89.3 KPCC. I'm Linda Othen-Gerard, and we're talking with Dr. Mike Dombeck, Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. And the phones are jammed, so we're going to start taking some of these calls. Let's go to Ned in Pasadena.
Thanks for the program. And
good morning to you, Ned.
Yes. Well, speaking of losses, the timber program, I believe, in Sequoia National Forest, which is the southern end of Sierra Nevadas here in California, and home to the Sequoia National Forest is home to 50% of the remaining sequoias, the giant trees. The losses on the timber program, I believe, are something over the last 10 years of $1 million a year in selling timber there. And so my first point, I guess, is that it doesn't really make sense, as your previous caller said, to be charging individual recreationists to use the forest for what's basically a fairly benign use, while we're handing out a lot of money building roads for loggers and undercutting private timber companies who have to pay for their own roads to come up with a really good restoration of the sequoia groves in the Sequoia National Forest.
Ned, thanks so much for your call.
Yes, thank you.
Ned, thanks for your comments. Let me address the sequoia issue. We are, like you, very, very concerned about the sequoias, and the fact organism, and that's the bristlecone pine on the Inyo National Forest, and the tallest are the redwoods. So right here in California, you sort of have three very unique species. We, in the forest planning process, will continue to focus on the sequoias, and in fact, I believe there's a public meeting and some gathering of scientists, the experts in forest management, and the local people to really focus on additional things that we need to be doing to perpetuate the sequoias, because the concern that we all have, is we want these trees here for future generations, and that's very, very important to us. With regard to your other comment concerning the economics and so on of timber sales and below-cost timber sales and these kinds of things, my view is that the timber controversies in the U.S. won't die down very much until we start talking about the desired future condition of the land. We need to be talking about how we leave the land, what we leave rather than what we take. We ought to be focusing on common goals, because in many cases you need management activities on the land because they have been disturbed. We've suppressed fire for almost 100 years. We've got to be doing some thinning, some fuel treatments, some fuel reductions, prescribed fire, and these kinds of things. So management activities are important, and if we can determine the desired future condition, then apply the best science, the most up-to-date science and technologies to get there, then I believe that the timber debates and so on will begin to die down. Now, another point with regard to timber, we're consuming more timber in the United States than we ever have. So where is it going to come from?
Ned, I can't answer that question.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, I wanted to ask you about this, about timber sales and whether this whole reduction in logging and the decline in the timber industry here in the United States has solely to do with pressure from environmentalists, or does it also have to do with globalization of the timber industry?
And Ned, we were harvesting just 10 years ago. The largest harvest that ever came off of the National Forest was a little bit over 12 billion board feet per year. Now we're offering and selling somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 billion board feet per year. We're at the timber harvest levels on the National Forest today that we were in the 1950s. And I don't think anybody questions the fact that the big timber era of the 70s and 80s was too much. Even the most commodity-oriented people believe that, and we've ratcheted that down. But another important thing is the change in timber management practices. We do 70 to 80% less clear cutting today than we did 10 to 15 years ago. We're moving much more toward lighter on the land technologies, almost back to, in some cases, to the single tree type management that was practiced several decades ago. Another thing that's important with regard to timber sales is now about 70 to 80% of our timber management operations have objectives beyond commercial timber harvest. To restore watersheds, we've got off-site species, and by that I mean species that aren't the best suited or the native species in an area because of total fire suppression, plywoods in various wood technologies that are really important.
But Mike Dombeck, where is that wood going to come from? If it doesn't come from here, we'll be buying it from someplace else.
Our imports from Canada have increased from about 10 billion board feet to about 18 billion. So as we see these reductions that have occurred from national forests, one of the things that concerns a lot of people, and I ask is it appropriate for us to transfer our needs to lands where there are lesser environmental protection?
Well, open question. Maybe our listeners will have something to say about that. Mike, on a cell phone, go ahead, California. What can you tell us about these two alternatives of the plan?
Well, I'm here to learn about some of the issues, and in fact, our regional forester, Brad Powell, is here with us and has been involved in all of the details, and perhaps can give more detail than I can. But I would like to say a couple of things about the Quincy plan. One of the things that pleases me is the fact that you have a true collaborative approach. You have a variety of people getting together to focus on an issue that was of concern to them, and I commend them for that. And I also have, and we are moving forward with the Quincy effort, and Brad will comment on that. But I do have one concern. With 155 national forests in the United States, my hope is that each national forest wouldn't be managed by a different piece of legislation, because what that will do is that will increase the cost of management significantly and increase the complexity of that.
Brad Powell is with us here. He's the regional forester for Region 5. Tell us a little bit about this plan. What is it, and what is it going to do to California's national forests?
Why, good morning. I think the most important thing about the plan, and Mike already mentioned it, is we're pleased that it was developed in a collaborative fashion. We made a decision back in August to implement one of the alternatives. It was a part of the environmental analysis that was conducted. That decision is in the process of being implemented. In the next few months, we should be able to put some of these demonstration projects on the ground and see if they actually work. The Quincy project really is an attempt to balance fire protection needs, economic needs for the communities, and wildlife and ecosystem habitat needs. We think that the alternative that was selected does a good job of that. We intend to analyze that over the next few years as required in the bill itself and see if it really meets those objectives.
And can you give us some specifics? What is it actually going to do to your policy? Give us some board feet specifics.
Well, let me try and do that. Without getting too technical on it, it requires us, the bill itself, to experiment with what are called defensible fuel profile zones. I know that's a technical sounding term, but they're really fuel breaks that would be constructed through the forest. It also requires us to take a look and construct some group selection harvest. Now, the intent of that is, again, to make the forest in a condition less prone to large fires. As a result of that, and it's anticipated in the bill that about 40,000 acres per year would be conducted in these types of harvest to reduce the fire hazard. Now, our intent is to experiment with that. We hope this year to do about half of that, about 20,000 acres. Will generate about 100 million board feet of products as we do that. Some of those are economic, some of those are uneconomic in terms of being able to sell those, but it will be a good experiment, an opportunity for us to see whether it's economic, whether it meets our needs for wildlife habitat, and whether it reduces the fuel risk and thus the risk of catastrophic fires in those areas.
Mike Dombeck, we're out of time, but I have one question. You were talking about how important it is for where all of these different competing interests can take advantage of the resource, and also about hearing what all these different interests have to say. You want a policy that responds to what the people want, but how do you know what they want?
I think we have a more extensive and open process than we've ever had in developing long-term goals for national forests, in fact all of public lands, and we're in the process of developing new planning regulations. In fact, they have been out for public comment, where one of the changes we've made is rather than us developing a plan and then having the public, the owners of the national forest comment on that plan, they will actually be involved right up front in setting the long-term goals for what we want from the land. And I think the most important message that I can leave with all our listeners is that we have to share. As we have a growing population, in fact, if we think of the Angeles National Forest with 11 million people within 1 hour of the Angeles National Forest, there's not enough to go around for everyone to have all of what they want. So we've got to share, we've got to give and compromise. But the most important thing is to maintain the integrity of the forest, the watershed function, the ecological function, so we have this resource generation after generation.
Mike Dombeck, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning. And Brad Powell, thank you very much. Mike Dombeck is the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Brad Powell joined us. He's the Regional Forester for Region 5, which includes California. You're listening to Talk of the City on FM 89.3 KPCC Pasadena, Los Angeles, Orange County. Up next, we'll talk about a new study that reveals what Angelenos are dying from when we come back right after this.
Next.